I woke to find my truck chained like a criminal in my own driveway. Karen and her HOA called it enforcement, but what they really did was hand me the very rope to pull them under. While they gloated over a boot, my father walked into their meeting with a banker's folder that froze every dollar they owed. And that was only the beginning. The morning air was crisp enough to see my breath. I had a mug of black coffee in one hand and Scout's leash in the other, expecting nothing more dramatic than his usual sniff around the mailbox. The neighborhood was still save for the low rumble of a lawnmower a few streets over. I rounded the corner of my driveway and froze. My truck, my old Ford F-150, sat shackled with a glaring yellow boot. A sheet of paper flapped against the windshield taped awkwardly words in block print screaming through the quiet HOA violation overnight parking. For a moment, I thought it had to be a mistake. I kept the truck in my own driveway on my own deeded property. It wasn't an abandoned car or some eyesore on cinder blocks. It was my daily lifeline, the machine that hauled lumber groceries, the occasional bag of potting soil, and now it looked like a criminal cuffed and exposed to the entire street. Scout whined at my side, tugging at the leash. I set the coffee down on the porch rail and crouched near the boot. Cold metal glinted under the morning sun. When I nudged it with my shoe, the lock answered with a dull clack, final and absolute. Across the cul-de-sac, Mrs. Henderson was dragging her trash bin to the curb. She slowed, tilted her head, and muttered just loud enough to carry Karen's itching to raise fees again. She shook her head and kept walking. The sting wasn't just in the metal clamp, it was in the eyes of every neighbor who would drive by today seeing me branded as the rule breaker. I dialed the HOA office. After 2 rings, a syrupy recorded voice told me to stay on the line. Tinny hold music filled my ear, an instrumental version of Don't Stop Believin', looping endlessly. 5 minutes passed. 10. Finally, a young-sounding receptionist answered, rattling off her name so quickly I barely caught it. "My truck has a boot on it," I said. "In my own driveway. What's going on?" "Sir, you'll need to discuss that with the board. Their office hours are Tuesday afternoons. It's Monday morning. I need this resolved now. Hold, please." The music returned. I stared at the notice taped to my windshield, the edges curling in the cool breeze. My coffee had gone cold by the time I hung up, no closer to an answer. That's when I saw her. Karen Delaney, president of the Crestwood Meadows HOA, strode up the sidewalk with her clipboard like a sheriff with a badge. She wore a pressed red blouse, hair pulled into a taut ponytail, smile as wide as the boot on my truck. "Good morning, Mr. Boone," she said, the cheer in her voice as artificial as the begonias she planted in front of her mailbox. "What is this?" I gestured at the clamp. "New parking restrictions," she replied, tapping her clipboard. "Passed just last week. All overnight vehicles must be pre-approved. My truck has been here every night since I moved in." No one said a word. Her smile didn't budge. That was then. "We're raising standards around here." Scout let out a low growl. Karen leaned slightly away, scribbling something on her clipboard. "You can have it removed for a fee," she continued lightly as though she were suggesting a new casserole recipe. $250. Otherwise, storage charges begin tonight. The number landed like a slap. $250 for parking in my own driveway. I opened my mouth, but she was already pivoting back toward her immaculate crossover SUV. "Have a wonderful day," she called over her shoulder. I stood there long after she left, the weight of the clamp pulling at my chest as much as the truck's wheel. Fragile peace had cracked in an instant, and the crack ran deeper than steel on rubber. That evening, the sun dropped behind the line of maples, leaving the street in a hush broken only by cicadas. I sat on the porch, Scout curled at my feet, trying to read the local paper but circling back to the same paragraph. The air smelled of damp leaves. Then came the sound of a heavy diesel engine turning onto my street. Headlights crawled along the cul-de-sac, spotlighting every front porch. The tow truck stopped in front of my house, amber lights flashing, winch whining as it unspooled. I set the paper aside and gripped the porch rail. The chain hooked, the metal groaned, and my truck lurched forward. Neighbors' curtains shifted in the windows across the way. No one stepped outside. Scout barked once sharp, then went silent, and I watched powerless as my truck was dragged from my driveway into the night. The impound lot sat on the edge of town, pressed against the railroad tracks where freight cars groaned day and night. I pushed through the gate, chain link rattling behind me, and found my truck wedged between 2 rusted sedans. Dust filmed the windshield. A second notice was slapped across the glass, red letters bleeding in the sun. Additional storage fee, $75 per day. I rested my hand on the hood, leaving a clean outline in the dust. This wasn't just a car. It was my one constant, the machine that had carried lumber for my father's shed, hauled boxes when I helped my sister move, dragged home groceries on humid Missouri afternoons. Now it looked abandoned, tagged like contraband. A man in a reflective vest shuffled by with a clipboard. "You Boone." "Yes. Fees are posted. Cashier's window inside." He didn't wait for an answer. Scout whined in the back seat of my sedan. I gave the truck one last pat and walked into the office, the smell of burnt coffee hitting me like a wall. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead and a copier hummed in the corner, spitting paper onto a tray already overflowing. Behind the counter stood Derek Shaw, vice president of the Crestwood HOA. His smile was as polished as his loafer's hands folded neatly on the desk. "Mr. Boone," he said, voice syrupy, "we all have to follow the same rules. This isn't about rules I shot back. It's about common sense. You can't boot and tow a man's truck from his own driveway." Derek shrugged, glancing toward the copier. "Rules apply equally. Without consistency, a community falls apart." I leaned on the counter close enough to see the reflection of fluorescent tubes in his glasses. "I've lived here long enough to know you pick and choose who gets cited. Henderson's camper has been in his drive all summer. No boot?" He smiled wider. "We'll get to Mr. Henderson." The door creaked open. Sheriff Miles Cooper stepped in, hat tilted back, hands tucked into his belt. He looked at me with tired eyes, then at Derek. "Got a complaint about towing?" "Yes," I said. "They've taken my truck. No hearing, no due process." The sheriff sighed, the sound heavy and final. "It's civil, Boone, not criminal. I can't get involved. You're telling me they can steal my truck and you can't lift a finger, not without a judge's order." He tipped his hat toward Derek. "Sorry." He left as quickly as he'd come, the door swinging shut on a draft of cold air. I stood there with the buzz of fluorescent lights drilling into my skull. Derek adjusted his cufflinks, smug in the silence. "Your best course," he said, "is to pay the fees and move on." I clenched my jaw and turned away, letting my eyes wander to the bulletin board by the copier. Notices and flyers overlapped in layers, garage sale announcements, lost dog posters, and bright-colored HOA bulletins. One caught my eye. Special assessment, proposed pool expansion. The flyer listed dollar figures in neat columns, projected costs, repayment schedules. My eyes tracked the fine print subject to existing loan obligations. I moved closer. At the bottom, in smaller type, a line glimmered like gold to me. "All repayments are guaranteed through liens and member dues." It hit me hard enough that I forgot Derek's smirk for a moment. The HOA wasn't flush with cash, not by a long shot. They were carrying debt, maybe a lot of it. And debt meant leverage. I pulled the towing receipt from my pocket, red ink blaring across the top. My fingers trembled not just with anger anymore, but with the first spark of something sharper. Hope, maybe. Behind me, Derek cleared his throat. "Like I said, pay your fees. The board appreciates cooperation." I folded the receipt, slid it into my jacket, and met his eyes. "We'll see who cooperates." The copier spit out another sheet, landing on the tray with a slap that echoed through the room. I left, without paying, Scout's tail thumping against the seat when I slid back into the sedan. As I pulled out of the lot, the chain-link gate clattered shut behind me. I muttered under my breath, barely loud enough for Scout to hear, "If anyone knew about that loan." My father answered on the second ring, his voice steady as a metronome. "You sound tired, Cal." "I am," I said. "Can you come by for dinner?" He arrived with a paper sack from Boone's Diner, 2 meatloaf plates sweating through their lids, and a pair of apple pies in the waxed paper. I warmed the coffee on the stove until the pot clicked. The kitchen felt smaller than usual, the yellow lamp pooling light over my stack of notes, and the towing receipt I'd unfolded so many times the crease had turned white. Dad set the sack down, removed his jacket with the slow economy of someone who saves energy for the things that matter, and took in the piles of paper. He nodded once like a doctor who's already read the chart. "Are you ready?" he asked for me to step into this fight. The question hung there between the steam and the smell of gravy. He'd never interfered much in my HOA business. He trusted me to live my life, and I tried not to drag him into neighbor politics. But this wasn't politics anymore, not with storage fees ticking and the sheriff shrugging. "I am," I said. "I need you." He pulled a spiral notebook from his inside pocket, thin with a cracked blue cover, and slid into the chair across from me. "Start at the beginning," he said, flipping to a clean page. "And don't leave out the boring parts. The boring parts are where money hides." I walked him through the last 2 days, the boot, the impound lot, Derek's sermon about equal rules, the sheriff's exit, the fluorescent lights that hummed like a headache. Dad didn't interrupt. He forked a corner of meatloaf and let it cool on his plate while he examined the storage notice with its red totals and the HOA flyer about a special assessment pool expansion. The meatloaf went cold. He didn't seem to notice. "Pool expansion," he murmured, "and this line, subject to existing loan obligations." He tapped the flyer with his pen. "Did you see an ID? A loan number. I spread my photocopies out like a dealer fanning cards. I thought I did here bottom right. Looks like 7421, no, 742L something. It was partly covered by a thumbtack." "Hand me the charter copy," he said. I passed it over. He scanned the bylaws with an old banker's patience, finding the parts most people skip: assessment authority, lien conditions, repayment guarantees. He circled a paragraph that referenced secured financing for capital improvements and underlined the clause about delinquency remedies. "This," he said, "is not unusual. What matters is who owns the paper underlying that loan and what the covenants say. If they've borrowed against assessments and dues, the bank has outsized leverage, sometimes more than the board realizes." He pulled my towing receipt closer, his thumb landing on the date stamp. "They're counting on you to go away, Cal. Turn the key, pay the fee. Don't." The back door rattled. A figure hovered in the dim of the carport window, then knocked 3 quick taps like a bird beak. I stood to look. Lila Chen. Treasurer. She clutched a folder the color of wet cardboard. I opened the door. "Lila." "I can't stay," she said, voice thin with nerves. "I shouldn't be here." Her eyes skittered past me to my father at the table. I just wanted to bring you this." She held the folder out and pulled it back, then pushed it forward again. "Quarterly summaries," she whispered. "Public records, technically." Dad said nothing. He just watched her with that weathered, steady face that used to convince jittery farm co-ops to sign on the dotted line. Lila looked at the floor tiles as if they might swallow her. "I don't want trouble," she said, "but what they're doing—" She cut herself off and bit her lower lip. "I have to go." She crossed the carport and disappeared, sandals slapping softly on the concrete. I closed the door and set the latch. Dad waited until the sound of her car faded, then opened the folder. Inside, tidy columns, neat dates, a cover sheet that said Crestwood Meadows, HOA Q2 and Q3 collections. The bank logo sat in the top right corner, subtle like a watermark hiding in plain sight. He tilted the pages toward the lamp. "There it is," he said softly. "A loan number, legible and whole. $180,000 clubhouse upgrades, lighting pool resurfacing. 2-year draw, 5-year amortization. They've tied it to assessments and have a revolving line for overruns." His finger ran the schedule. "Payments are due the 1st of the month. They're cutting it close." "How close?" I asked. He smiled without humor. "Close enough they'll feel a shiver if the wind changes." He flipped another page. Delinquencies rose and fell like a fever chart. Notes in the margin read, "Reminder sent second notice intent to lien." Somewhere in the list, my own name appeared next to violation fees pending. I swallowed. The paper tasted like chalk. "Dad?" I said, "If this loan is what I think it is." He nodded. "They're at the bank's mercy, Cal, not the other way around." He set the folder square with the edge of the table, aligning the corners, a small ritual I remembered from my childhood when he balanced a ledger before dinner. "What they did to your truck is theater. The real show is in these numbers." I leaned back, the chair creaking under me. A part of me wanted to rant about fairness, about neighbors who stare through curtains but won't open doors, about Derek's practiced smile. Another part, the old code auditor who once measured setbacks with a ruler and a patience my ex-wife used to call stubbornness, leaned into the facts. "What's the move?" I asked. "We need the covenant excerpts that allow the bank to intervene if the board mismanages funds or violates terms," he said, already writing a list in the blue notebook. "And we want the compliance letter. There's always a compliance letter. If they've pushed an assessment through without proper notice, the bank will sniff it." He lifted his fork, finally taking a bite of the meatloaf. It had cooled to room temperature. He didn't flinch. "Are you ready?" he said again for me to step in. I watched his hand, still steady, even at 82, rest on the folder. The yellow lamp made a warm halo on his knuckles. Scout snored under the table paws, twitching in a dream. I picked up my pen, feeling its weight like a lever. "Yes," I said. "I'm ready." He capped his pen and slid the folder to me. "Then we push once, and we push where it hurts." I gripped my pen harder. "Dad." I said the word catching in my throat like it did when I was 10 and afraid of the dark. "I need you back in the ring." He didn't smile. He just nodded, which meant more. We ate the rest of dinner in a silence that wasn't empty. It was the kind of quiet that comes before a storm you intend to survive. When we finished, he stacked the plates, straightened the pages again, and tore a sheet from his notebook with a small, satisfying rip. Bank contact. Covenant citation. Account officer's name. Things I could chase first thing in the morning. Outside, the cicadas droned on. Inside, the lamp hummed. Somewhere between the two, I felt the ground shift under my feet from powerless anger to something with aim. By the time I reached the storage yard, the gate hung a little off-level, as if even the hinges were tired of seeing people's mistakes. A new slip flapped under my truck's wiper. Unpaid, stamped in red, diagonal, and loud. The F-150 had been hauled deeper into the lot, past dented panels and sunburnt paint, into a corner where padlocks clinked whenever the breeze cut through. The air smelled like old oil and wet cardboard. I ran my palm along the door seam and came away with grit. Someone had chalked a number across the rear tire. The mark looked like a scar. A chain rattled. Karen Delaney stepped through a side gate in tennis shoes so white they almost glowed. She had the clipboard again tucked into the crook of her elbow, and a smile she wore like sunscreen applied in a thick layer meant to block anything real. "Mr. Boone." Her voice lifted bright as a TV anchor. "Here, about your truck." "What did you do?" I asked. "It was already towed. Why move it deeper in?" She looked past me at the impound office window where a reflective vest bobbed like a buoy. "Inventory optimization," she said. "We're working with our vendor to ensure compliance." "Compliance." I repeated the word, tasting like a paper cut. Karen leaned closer. Perfume sharp and citrusy. "Nobody backs rule breakers," she murmured. "It's easier for everyone when standards are maintained." I stepped between her and the truck. "I've paid my dues every quarter I said. I mow, I trim, I keep my porch light working. But you don't want neighbors, you want subjects." Her smile didn't move, but something in her eyes cooled. "You can have it all resolved for a simple fee," she said, tapping the clipboard. "Or you can continue to make this difficult." Scout waiting in my sedan with the window cracked gave a low whine. I took my phone out and, hands steadier than I expected, photographed the red stamped slip, the chalk mark the corner location. Karen watched the lens with a cat's patience. "Pictures won't change the rules," she said. "No," I said, "but they remember what people forget." A gust pushed through the chain link, and somewhere a length of loose fence wire twanged like a flat guitar string. Karen checked her watch, then straightened. "Board meets Thursday," she said lightly. "Perhaps you should attend. We'll be discussing community cooperation." She pivoted away without waiting for an answer. The gate caught and clanged shut behind her. By Thursday evening, the HOA meeting room had the damp smell of a YMCA hallway, sweaty plastic chairs, coffee that had been kept warm past the point of kindness. A projector hummed against the back wall, throwing a pale rectangle onto the pull-down screen. People trickled in, cheeks flushed from the walk, eyes curious and guarded. I took a seat near the middle where I could see the board and the door. Derek Shaw arranged handouts along the front table, his smile polished enough to throw reflections. Karen settled into the center chair, straight-backed, two pens laid parallel in front of her. Lila Chen sat 2 seats down, fingers worrying the edge of a manila folder. Derek cleared his throat. "Welcome, Crestwood neighbors." He spoke like an audiobook, smooth with a built-in nod. "We've had a busy quarter. Improvements are ongoing. We appreciate your cooperation." Slides clicked by photos of a freshly painted pergola, the pool under early spring sun, a mock-up of the future clubhouse lobby. A bullet list titled Special Assessment Proposal flashed, then moved on as if accidentally too quickly. I raised my hand. "I have a question about towing and storage procedures." Karen's smile widened. "Questions will be addressed during public comments, Mr. Boone." Behind me, someone whispered, "That's the truck guy." Another voice, "He should have just paid." A third, softer, "I heard it was overnight parking. Rules are rules. Rules are rules." The phrase floated like a paper boat, flimsy but determined. When the comment period finally opened, I stood. The room pivoted, eyes finding and fixing. "My truck was booted in my driveway," I said, keeping my voice even, "then towed, then moved deeper into storage with new fees added. I haven't had a hearing. I haven't received certified notice." Derek spread his hands in a performance of empathy. "We apply the bylaws evenly, Mr. Boone. Overnight parking is restricted without pre-approval. Notices were posted. In the clubhouse on a corkboard behind a flyer for dog walking, I said, 'Not to the person whose property you're touching.'" Karen's pen made a neat tap against the table. "We're striving for a cooperative spirit. Unfortunately, some residents have chosen a combative path." Murmurs swelled pockets of approval and disapproval rising like thermal currents. I felt the heat of stares along my neck. A phone vibrated at the end of the row. The woman holding it frowned at her screen, then glanced up at me. She turned her device slightly, and for an instant the light caught an image. A group chat labeled Crestwood Leaders. A screenshot bloomed my name and the text my address a line that punched through the glow. Boone refuses to comply. Make him the example. My stomach went cold. The woman locked her screen, guilty color rising to her cheeks, and tucked the phone away. I swallowed and kept my voice level. Is the board using residents as examples? Karen's smile thinned. We're using the tools available to encourage compliance. Consistency is kindness. Kindness, I said, and felt the word tip toward bitter. I went to the yard to photograph the new fees. I have the slips. I raised my phone, the red stamps bright even in the room's pale light. A man near the back said, "He's taking pictures now. That's not allowed." The room shifted against me. An old boat adjusting to a stubborn passenger. I caught Lila's eye. She stared at the tabletop as if reading a letter only she could see. Karen leaned forward, one elbow on the table, and her voice dropped into a register meant for one person. "No one here," she said, "will stand with you." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. I felt the sentence slide into place like a bolt. The chair under me creaked. I looked around the room and saw 100 tiny choices being made, crossed arms, lowered eyes, a neighbor's mouth set in the polite line that says, "I'm not involved." The projector fan whirred. Somewhere a child's laughter echoed faintly from the playground outside. I slid the phone back into my pocket. "Understood," I said. Karen straightened, recovered that easy tone that photographs well. "Next agenda item," she said, crisp. "Pool safety." Derek's slides resumed their orderly march. I stared at the screen without seeing it, the edges of things going soft the way they do in heavy weather. Lila shifted in her chair. Her hand hovered over the manila folder, then settled palm flat as if to quiet the papers within. I stayed until the gavel ticked the meeting closed. People stood in clusters talking about deck stain and lawn service. A few glanced my way and then looked elsewhere in the way we do when a person reminds us of responsibility. On my way out, Derek stepped into my path. "It's best not to escalate," he said in a voice he probably used with upset clients. "There are processes." "I know, process," I said. "I worked it for 30 years. He blinked, smile thinning. Then you know he angled his head toward the bulletin board with its kaleidoscope of notices how this works. I stepped around him and pushed open the door. The evening had cooled. The clubhouse lights threw long rectangles across the lawn and the scent of chlorine slipped in from the pool fence. Outside, I paused. The breath I let out fogged a moment in the cooler air, then drifted away. My jaw had set sometime between the chain link and the projector screen. I could feel the ache of it now, a steady, useful pain. Fine. If I was alone, I would act like a man who could stand it. I walked to my car, the gravel popping under my soles, and knew I would have to strike harder. By spring, the driveway looked bigger than it ever had when the truck was parked there. Bare concrete, a rectangle of nothing. The mailbox leaned a little from winter heaves stuffed with envelopes that all seemed to wear the same thin scowl. I took them inside and dropped them on the coffee table where a stack of unpaid bills had become a kind of terrain, peaks of red ink valleys of polite reminders. A certified letter from the storage vendor sat on top, scarlet totals stamped at the bottom like a rash. Balance due. I set it next to my 401k statement and the towing invoice. The paper edges didn't line up. It bothered me in a way I couldn't explain. My hand rested on the retirement statement long enough to smudge the print with sweat. The house smelled like cold coffee and lemon dish soap. Scout had the good sense to sleep through most of this chin on pause, ears twitching when the refrigerator cycled on. I tried to read the numbers again, but the clock on the wall ticked past 11, then midnight, and the digits on the page kept sliding off their places. When Dad came by in the morning, he didn't comment on the mess. He set his hat on the chair back and eased himself down with a small sound my mother used to tease him about halfway between a sigh and a chuckle. He reached for the folder we'd built and opened it like a carefully made door. "Let's walk the line," he said, tapping a finger against the loan schedule. The vellum crackled. Interest posted on the 1st. Late fees if not paid by the 10th. Here, he drew a neat dot with his pen. They squeaked through last month, but you can see the float. I leaned over the table. Past due interest had left a faint breadcrumb trail, tiny charges stacked like coins you forget in your pocket until the washer clatters. They're cutting it close, I said. Closer than they know, he replied. You were right about the pool. They're in mid-spend. The bank gives rope until it doesn't. I looked at the certified letter again. 8 weeks of storage at $75 a day, plus the boot removal that never happened. My name typed in bold. Under it, an address I knew by heart and now hated to see on paper. Maybe I should just pay it, I heard myself say. The voice didn't sound like mine. It had stopped the bleeding. Dad didn't tell me not to feel that way. He reached for the 401k statement and held it in both hands, thumbs anchored on the corners. How much would you pull? Enough, I said. Whatever it takes. I tried to joke, but the words fell flat. Guess I always wanted to pay a penalty for the privilege. He lifted the statement so the light from the window skimmed across the totals. This is what you earned, he said. Not what they can take. The phone on the counter buzzed a text from an unknown number that I somehow knew. Lila Chen appeared a second later when a second text came through. I shouldn't be messaging, but please look at page 3 of the bank packet. Note the grace clause. It's thin. A dot appeared like she might add more, then disappeared. I turned the pages while Dad watched. Page 3 hid under a cover letter. He slid his reading glasses down from his forehead and leaned in. Grace clause, he murmured, reading under his breath. Bank reserves right to suspend further draws and review collateral if compliance concerns are substantiated by… Look at that. By a complaint supported with documentation. He looked up, eyes brighter than his voice. Cal, they wrote us the path. My throat tightened. And if we step on it wrong, then the bank says no, he said. And they tow your truck again in their hearts. But if we step right, the board loses air. I set the certified letter aside away from the retirement statement as if distance between papers could make distance between outcomes. He turned to a page marked Amortization. Little boxes marched across in rows, principal and interest sharing a narrow bench. They built this project like a bridge, he said. It'll hold as long as every rivet stays tight. All we have to do is show the bank a loose one. What counts as loose, I asked. Improper notice. Misuse of assessment. Anything that looks like a board deciding first and asking their lawyer to bless it later. He pressed his palm gently on the stack, feeling for its heartbeat. You have photos. Slips. The group chat. We don't need a speech. We need a package. I nodded, but the room swam a little. The storage totals had crawled into my head and started to nest. I pinched the bridge of my nose and blew out a breath. Dad. I said I hate this. I hate that my life is a set of papers on a table and a truck in a cage. He didn't pat my shoulder or say it would be fine. He pushed the coffee mug toward me and refreshed it from the pot. Drink, he said simply, then write. The clock ticked noon. Sun crept across the carpet and lit up the dust we pretend we don't live with. I opened a new legal pad, wrote the date at the top, and underlined it twice. Complaint package. I listed what I had and what I needed, photos with timestamps, towing invoices with signatures, the HOA bulletin with the assessment note, the charter paragraph with the lien language, and the sliver of that group chat someone had let me see. Make it clean, Dad said. Bankers like edges. I drafted while he flipped through the loan packet again, his fingertip pausing over a row of tiny numbers most people would never notice. They rolled a fee last quarter, he said. Not large, but it shouldn't be there if the draw closed when they said it did. He circled it with a soft, deliberate motion. Overdue interest. There's our rivet. A little after 2, the doorbell rang. Lila stood on the porch, sunglasses on though the sky had clouded over. She held a single sheet in one hand, knuckles white. I can't stay, she said without hello. I wanted you to see this. She handed me the paper. It was a bank memo, internal tone-clipped lines addressed to Crestwood Meadows HOA Board. The subject read Compliance Review Scheduling. There were dates, a line that said pending receipt of resident complaint, and a note about temporary suspension of additional draws may occur during review. Lila, I said, how did you… I didn't, she said quickly. You didn't get it from me. I have to go. She backed away with a small, miserable wave. Dad waited until the door closed. She's braver than she believes, he said. Don't waste it. We spread everything out one more time until the table disappeared under documents and their shadows. I added the memo to my checklist and wrote the bank officer's name from Dad's notebook in block letters. Despair had been a heavy coat these past months. Somewhere during the sorting and the circling and the numbering, I realized I'd unbuttoned it. It still lay across my shoulders, but air had gotten underneath. Dad capped his pen and smoothed the cover of the folder as if to bless it. If they keep booting, he said quietly, we freeze their credit. It's lawful leverage. The room was so still I could hear Scout's breathing and the soft tick of the kitchen clock. I looked at the certified letter again. The red totals felt like a dare and slid it into a separate stack labeled "For Court." Then I set my hand on the folder we'd made. It was heavier than it looked. I whispered it first to test the sound in the room. Then let's do it. Dad didn't move for a second. Then he nodded once. "All right," he said. "We do it." The clubhouse smelled like burnt coffee and copier ink, the kind of perfume a bureaucracy wears when it wants you to think it's awake. Folding chairs scraped tile as neighbors settled in. The fluorescent lights hummed hard enough to fray patience. Derek rehearsed a smile at the lectern. Karen arranged her pens into a neat parallel like runway lights. The room had that smug, buzzing energy I'd come to expect rules about to be read to people who already knew them. Lila slipped into the seat beside me, eyes rimmed red. Without looking up, she slid a sheet of paper from a folded program and tucked it under my palm. I felt the tremor in her hand. The page was a printout email header stacked like ladder rungs, subject line blunt as a brick RE overnight parking enforcement. One line was highlighted in yellow Karen's name in the "from field" like a watermark. The sentence glowed through the fiber of the paper boot Boone's truck tonight. "Make it public." The room dimmed another notch in my ears. I slipped the page into my folder, the red county seal on the front catching the light like a stop sign. At 7 sharp, the PA crackled and squealed, mic feedback spiking so high half the room winced. Derek tapped the microphone twice and whispered, testing, unaware everyone could hear him. Then, "Good evening, Crestwood neighbors," he intoned. "Tonight, we'll review progress on improvements, clarify parking policies, and preview exciting plans for the summer season." Karen's smile did not move. She looked like a portrait. When he opened the floor for the board's business, the back door pushed open with the softest thud. Every head turned. My father walked in carrying our folder with the red seal his tie straight as a plumb line. He didn't hurry, and he didn't posture. He simply moved to the front as if this were his ordinary route. Karen blinked twice slow. "Can we help you?" she said, too sweet, as if asking a child to use his inside voice. Milton set the folder on the table and turned it so the seal faced the room. "I'm Milton Boone," he said, voice even and clear. "Former regional bank director. I'm here on behalf of my son, a resident in good standing. I have a notice from Crestwood Meadows' lender." He unlaced the string, drew out a single-page letter, and laid a photocopy beside it for the board. The crisp paper made a sound like new snow. Derek reached for the copy. "Sir, if you'd like to speak during public comment," Dad read over the microphone before Derek could reclaim control. "Notice of temporary suspension of line of credit," he said. The room tightened. Even the fluorescent hum seemed to fade. "Loan number ending 742L. Amount $180,000. Suspended pending compliance review. Further draws halted until documentation concerns are resolved." He looked up, eyes steady as old oak. "Effective immediately." Gasps spun through the chairs in ripples. Someone dropped a pen that skittered under 2 rows. A neighbor whispered, "The pool," like she'd just watched summer itself crack. Karen reached for the copy like it might bite. "This is outrageous," she snapped. "You can't." Milton didn't raise his voice. "I'm not asking. I'm informing." Derek's smile fractured. "Perhaps we should take a recess." Lila covered her face with both hands, shoulders tightening as if bracing for weather. I set my phone on the table and tapped the record icon. The tiny red light winked to life and stared up at us like a patient witness. "For accuracy," I said. "So no one struggles to remember later." Karen's gaze dropped to the blinking dot and sharpened. "Turn that off," she said. "It's a public meeting," I answered. "I'll keep my voice down." Derek tried to chuckle and landed on a cough. "Neighbors, there is no cause for alarm. Our relationship with the bank is—" Milton slid a second document forward. "Compliance letter," he said. "It references resident documentation supporting concerns over notice and misuse of assessment authority." His forefinger came down lightly on the top line. "You'll find attached time-stamped photographs of towing slips FE add-ons and internal communications." He didn't look my way, didn't have to. "They've also received an email." Karen's cheeks colored up to the hairline. "We follow bylaws," she said, each word carved. "We have absolute authority to enforce overnight parking." I unfolded Lila's printout and set it beside the microphone so only the board could see. The highlighted line glowed canary under the fluorescence. "Make it public," I read, keeping my voice level. "That doesn't sound like safety. It sounds like theater." A low murmur rose, not quite a wave, more like a wind beginning. A man 2 rows back rubbed his jaw as if working out a bad taste. A woman near the aisle folded her arms and stared at Karen as though meeting her for the first time. Derek spoke too fast. "Let's not jump to conclusions. The board may have made a decision and asked your lawyer to bless it later." Milton said, calm as a ledger. "You're free to try, but your lender has frozen further draws. That includes funds earmarked for summer projects." He let the last word sit in the air where the word pool wanted to be. He didn't say it. He didn't need to. Karen slapped the table with her palm. The microphone squealed again. Half the room flinched. "You can't do this." Milton didn't blink. "We already did." Silence hit so hard I could hear the weak compressor cycle in the mini-fridge by the back wall. On the screen behind the board, the idle slideshow timed out and flashed to the default desktop blue hills and a lonely recycle bin. For a second, nobody moved. Then sound returned in fragments, chair legs scraping, someone clearing a throat, a child outside calling for a parent. Lila dropped her hands and stared at the table, eyes bright and wet. Karen groped for control. "We'll appeal to the Board of Banking?" She tripped on the noun, then recovered. "We'll convene an emergency session. This community will not be bullied by documentation," I asked. The phone's red eye blinked. "By your own email." A neighbor I barely knew lifted a shaky hand. "Is this why my dues notice went up?" he asked. To cover fees, Karen's keys set too close to the table's edge rattled as she gestured. They teetered right at the lip. Derek leaned into the microphone to reclaim any scrap of structure. "We're going to pause to consult counsel. Please remain calm while the board." The loudspeaker crackled to life above him, the ancient PA unit deciding to participate. A voice from the hallway, maybe the facility manager, came through, tinny and authoritative. Meeting adjourned. For a heartbeat, nobody processed it. Then, movement everywhere. Folding chairs snapped shut. Conversations broke open like bags of marbles. Karen's keys slid off the table and hit tile with a hard, bright clatter that turned 3 heads. She stared at them like they'd betrayed her. Lila made a small sound, half sob, half relief, and pressed her fist against her mouth. I kept the camera steady. The little red light blinked on-off on metronome to a moment I wanted seared into the record. Milton gathered the documents with the same unhurried care he'd used laying them down. He nodded once to the room, not a bow or a gloat, just acknowledgement, and handed the copy of the notice to Derek. "Keep that," he said. "You'll need it." The envelope was so ordinary I almost tossed it with the pizza coupons. No red stamp, no bold threats. Inside, one line changed the air in my kitchen release authorized. Storage fees canceled. I held it until my hand shook. Scout lifted his head from the rug tail thumping as if he knew the tide had turned. By noon, my father and I were back at the impound lot. The clerk slid a clipboard toward me. The pen scratched across the release form, leaving a faint smear like oil. Dad pointed with his knuckle. Initial there, too. Dates matter. Then we walked out to the far corner where the truck sat. Chalk marks, fading dust caked across the hood. The engine coughed when I turned the key, then steadied like a voice clearing itself after silence. Driving it through the chain-link gate felt like crossing a border. Neighbors glanced as I rolled onto our street. The cicadas were so loud it sounded like the wires overhead were alive. I eased into the driveway that had been bare too long. The truck fit like it had never left. Dad set the papers on the hood to dry in the sun, his pen scratching once more as he signed witness. "Keep them safe," he murmured. "Not because we'll need them, because you'll rest easier." A knock came from the curb. Mrs. Henderson, cheeks flushed, held out a peach pie. "We should have spoken up earlier," she said. "I'm sorry." Behind her, her husband nodded sheepish. I took the pie and the apology both. More followed. James, from the corner, his boy tugging his sleeve. "I like your truck." Then Lila's sedan pulled up. She stepped out with a folded sheet in hand. "Karen's been forced out," she whispered. Board voted. Derek's interim. She opened the paper, an embossed seal glinting. "Lien release filed this morning." I thanked her. The words carried more weight than the page. We cut the pie on the tailgate with a plastic knife. The sugar crust flaked in the heat. Scout stationed himself under the bumper, catching crumbs. Conversations stumbled, then smoothed tires, oil changes, summer plans. The past months lingered, but no longer ruled. Dad read the release one more time, then folded it into the folder we'd carried through too many rooms. "Check the copy when it comes," he said. "Numbers matter." He patted the fender, eyes soft. As dusk stretched across the cul-de-sac, neighbors drifted home. Lila lingered. "It won't fix everything," she said, "but it's moving." I laid my palm on the hood. The heat pressed back solid and real. Balance at last, though not the end. Looking at the mailbox leaning slightly under its load, I muttered to myself, this isn't over. Not yet. Spring opened the clubhouse windows and let the air in cut grass a drift of barbecue from the park shelter. The light squeak of a banner being tied above the door. The folding chairs were out again, but the room felt different, less fluorescent hum, more conversation. Karen's seat sat empty, not reserved, just unclaimed, and nobody pretended not to notice. The new board took their places faces I knew from mailbox waves and winter salt buckets, not from glossy headshots. Lila sat at the treasurer's spot with a pen that clicked only once before she set it down. Derek hovered a chair to the side. Interim, now posture a little humbler tie, a shade less certain. Dad and I pulled up in the truck and eased onto the grass apron by the walk. The engine idled low, and even a sound that had gone from accusation to assurance these past months. We dropped the tailgate. The old steel chest sat where it always had, its lid scuffed the latch, polished by 1,000 openings. Inside, bungee cord socket sets the jumper cables that had rescued 3 neighbors and once a church van. The chest's weight was its own kind of truth. People filtered out of the clubhouse in pairs, paper cups in hand. Someone handed Scout a biscuit. He took it with ceremonial gravity and lay under the bumper like he'd been assigned to guard duty. The park grill popped and sighed in the breeze. Good smells wandered over the lawn and made even the bylaws feel more human. "Meeting will come to order," said Ruth Ellison, newly elected chair, a retired school principal who had spent the winter reminding us all how to listen. She wore a cardigan in spring green and a look that said we were here to finish something and begin something else. "We have 3 items," she said, crisp but not sharp. "First, the public ledger. Second, quarterly audits. Third, parking enforcement reform." The room, half inside, half leaning through the open windows, went quiet in that good way when people mean to understand. Lila rose. Her voice didn't waver. "Item 1, she read, tapping a sheet where columns marched straight. "Monthly income and expense postings will be published to the community website and printed on the clubhouse bulletin board by the 5th of the following month. Vendor names, amounts, and purposes included." Her pen scratched as she initialed the page, an honest, ordinary sound that landed like a promise. "Item 2, Ruth said, taking the next paper. "Quarterly, third-party audits with reports available to any resident in good standing. Motion." A hand lifted near the window. So moved. Second, 2 voices at once. Ruth smiled. All in favor, hands rose like a field-finding sun. The eyes rolled across the room, easy as wind through the maples. "Item 3, she said, and the air tightened just a notch. Parking and towing." Lila lifted a small wooden plaque from a cardboard sleeve and set it on the table. Someone had carved it in clean block letters, then rubbed the grain with oil until the words looked older than the wood. Crestwood Charter Reformed. No booting without certified notice. Below that, in smaller line, hearing required 10 days written notice. A murmur moved through the hall. Not surprise recognition. Derek cleared his throat. "We've, tightened the language," he said, glancing my way without flinching. "Clarified procedure. Notices must be delivered certified mail or hand-signed receipt. After that, there's a hearing. No exceptions. Vendor contracts will be amended accordingly." Ruth raised the gavel and let it rest unstruck. Motion. A chorus this time. Lila wrote fast, then slowed for the signatures, her pen skating the margin as each board member added a name. The sound of ink on paper made the room feel stitched together. The applause started in the back, one pair of hands, then another, until it was a tide. It wasn't loud, the way anger is loud. It was deep, the way relief is deep. Dad stood beside me, hands in his pockets, eyes on the pen moving across the page. He nodded in time with the claps, a small, satisfied tempo. Ruth looked toward the door. "Mr. Boone," she said. "Would you say a word?" I felt the old tug to decline to let the paperwork speak. But Spring had opened the windows for a reason. I stepped up, suddenly aware of the barbecue smoke on my jacket and the faint grease on my hands from the tailgate latch. "I won't take long," I said. The microphone didn't squeal. Somebody had finally found its gentlest volume. We didn't fight to embarrass anyone. We fought because rules are supposed to hold us together, not pin one of us down. I was angry. Some days I still am. But this, I nodded at the wooden plaque at Lila's ledger at the signatures drying, this is the point. Fairness you can read and repeat and rely on. I glanced at the truck. It sat where anyone could see into its bed, the tool chest open, the sockets gleaming in their ranks like teeth ready for any bolt. "I don't want special treatment," I said. "I want a simple notice and a chance to answer. I think we all do." A low of agreement moved around the room the sound church pews make when a sentence lands where it should. Dad stepped up beside me not to take the microphone, just close enough that I felt the shape of his presence. His hand settled on my shoulder, warm and steady. He leaned so only I could hear. "Sometimes you beat them," he said, "by playing their game better and remembering why you're playing." I laughed in my throat quietly. "I remember." Ruth lifted the plaque and turned it toward the open windows so the folks outside could see. "Let's put this where it belongs," she said. She crossed to the entryway and hung it above the corkboard with the 2 small brass screws. The driver for the screws came from my box without ceremony. Derek held the door while she reached. When she tightened the second screw, the wood gave a soft seat-down sound like a chair finally pulled to the right place at the table. Photos snapped. Not many. Enough. We wheeled the truck a little closer to the lawn where the shade drew a neat edge across the grass. Kids ran past on their way to the playground, a red ball skipping like punctuation. Someone at the grill yelled, "Burgers up," and 3 fathers moved at once in the universal choreography of paper plates and relish jars. Neighbors came up one by one, not to gush, just to nod and say the small sentences that fix things. "Good to see it home." "About time. We'll come to the audits." Lila handed Ruth a folder labeled Public Ledger April, then slipped out to answer a phone, returning with the light look of problems expected and solvable. I closed the tool chest with the heel of my hand. The latch clicked a modest, perfect sound. Dad's hand left my shoulder and found the fender instead, tapping twice the way he does when a job meets his quiet standard. Ruth thanked people and gave a last reminder about sign-ups. The gavel came down once, not as a threat, but as punctuation. Evening slid in sideways through the open windows, all honey and long angles. I climbed into the cab. The key turned. The engine caught on the first try and settled into that familiar faithful idle. Through the windshield, the wooden sign reflected in the glass, the letters backwards but legible enough to feel true. I waved to the room, to the lawn, to the kids, and the grill smoke and the 2 brass screws. Scout hopped into his seat like he'd been practicing. Dad closed my door with the gentle push he'd given me at every important threshold. I eased off the grass and onto the lane. The hood took the light like a lake takes sunset, and for a second the whole thing's steel paint people shone. We rolled toward home.